Before this video starts, I highly recommend that you watch this entire video. You learn what inflation is and its cause, and it will help you get rich when no money's value. Inflation and unemployment are the two most talked about words in the contemporary society. These two are the big problems that plague all the economies. Almost everyone is sure that he knows what inflation exactly is, but it remains a source of great deal of confusion because it is difficult to define it unambiguously. Inflation is often defined in terms of its supposed causes. Inflation exists when money supply exceeds available goods and services. Or inflation is attributed to budget deficit financing. A deficit budget may be financed by additional money creation. But the situation of monetary expansion or budget deficit may not cause price level to rise. Hence the difficulty of defining inflation. Advertisements: inflation may be defined as a sustained upward trend in the general level of prices and not the price of only one or two goods. G. Ackley defined inflation as a persistent and appreciable rise in the general level or average of prices. In other words, inflation is a state of rising price level, but not rise in the price level. It is not high prices but rising prices that constitute inflation. It is an increase in the overall price level. A small rise in prices or a sudden rise in prices is not inflation, since these may reflect the short-term workings of the market. It is to be pointed out here that inflation is a state of disequilibrium when there occurs a sustained rise in price level. It is inflation if the prices of most goods go up. However, it is difficult to detect whether there is an upward trend in prices and whether this trend is sustained. That is why inflation is difficult to define in an unambiguous sense. Let's measure inflation rate. Suppose, in December 2007, the Consumer Price Index was 193.6 and, in December 2008 it was 223.8. Thus the inflation rate during the last 1 year was 223.8, 193.6/193.6, 115.6%. Advertisements: as inflation is a state of rising prices, deflation may be defined as a state of falling prices but not fall in prices. Deflation is, thus, the opposite of inflation, i.e., rise in the value or purchasing power of money. Disinflation is a slowing down of the rate of inflation. Essay on the types of inflation. As the nature of inflation is not uniform in an economy for all the time, it is wise to distinguish between different types of inflation. Such analysis is useful to study the distributional and other effects of inflation as well as to recommend anti-inflationary policies. Inflation may be caused by a variety of factors. Its intensity or pace may be different at different times. It may also be classified in accordance with the reactions of the government toward inflation. Thus, one may observe different types of inflation in the contemporary society. A. According to causes. Advertisements: the budget of the government reflects a deficit when expenditure exceeds revenue. To meet this gap, the government may ask the central bank to print additional money. Since pumping of additional money is required to meet the budget deficit, any price rise may be called deficit-induced inflation. For demand pull inflation, an increase in aggregate demand over the available output leads to a rise in the price level. Such inflation is called demand pull inflation, henceforth DPI. But why does aggregate demand rise? Classical economists attribute this rise in aggregate demand to money supply. If the supply of money in an economy exceeds the available goods and services, DPI appears. It has been described by Kalborn as a situation of too much money chasing too few goods. Keynesians hold a different argument. They argue that there can be an autonomous increase in aggregate demand or spending, such as a rise in consumption demand or investment or government spending, or a tax cut, or a net increase in exports, i.e., C and I and G and X, M, with no increase in money supply. This would prompt upward adjustment in price. Thus, DPI is caused by both monetary factors, classical argument, and non-monetary factors, Keynesian argument. DPI can be explained in terms of the following figure, Fig 11.2, where we measure output on the horizontal axis and price level on the vertical axis. In range 1, total spending is too short of full employment output, YF. There is little or no rise in price level. As demand now rises, output will rise. The economy enters range 2 where output approaches full employment situation. As the nature of inflation is not uniform in an economy for all the time, it is wise to distinguish between different types of inflation. Such analysis is useful to study the distributional and other effects of inflation as well as to recommend anti-inflationary policies. Inflation may be caused by a variety of factors. Its intensity or pace may be different. At different times note that, in this region, price level begins to rise. Ultimately, the economy reaches full employment situation, i.e., range 3, where output does not rise but price level is pulled upward. This is demand pull inflation. The essence of this type of inflation is too much spending chasing too few goods v cost push inflation. Inflation in an economy may arise from the overall increase in the cost of production. This type of inflation is known as cost push inflation, henceforth CPI. Cost of production may rise due to increase in the price of raw materials, wages, etc. Often trade unions are blamed for wage rise since wage rate is not market determined. Higher wage means higher cost of production. Prices of commodities are thereby increased. A wage price spiral comes into operation. But, at the same time, firms are to be blamed also for the price rise since they simply raise prices to expand their profit margins. Thus we have two important variants of CPI, wage push inflation and profit push inflation. Anyway, CPI stems from the leftward shift of the aggregate supply curve. Advertisements, B, according to speed or intensity, I creeping or mild inflation, if the speed of upward thrust in prices is very low then we have creeping inflation. What speed of annual price rise is a creeping one has not been stated by the economists. To some, a creeping or mild inflation is one when annual price rise varies between 2% and 3%. If a rate of price rise is kept at this level, it is considered to be helpful for economic development. Others argue that if annual price rise goes slightly beyond 3% mark, still then it is considered to be of no danger. 2. Walking inflation, if the rate of annual price increase lies between 3% and 4%, then we have a situation of walking inflation. When mild inflation is allowed to fan out, walking inflation appears. These two types of inflation may be described as moderate inflation. Advertisements. Often, one-digit inflation rate is called moderate inflation, which is not only predictable, but also keep people's faith on the monetary system of the country. People's confidence get lost once moderately maintained rate of inflation goes out of control and the economy is then it is argued that profit earners gain from inflation. Profit tends to rise during inflation. Seeing inflation, businessmen raise the prices of their products. This results in a bigger profit. Profit margin, however, may not be high when the rate of inflation climbs to a high level. However, speculators dealing in business in essential commodities usually stand to gain by inflation. Black marketeers are also benefited by inflation. Thus, there occurs a redistribution of income and wealth. It is said that rich becomes richer and poor becomes poorer during inflation. However, no such hard and fast generalizations can be made. It is clear that someone wins and someone loses from inflation. These effects of inflation may persist if inflation is unanticipated. However, the redistributive burdens of inflation on income and wealth are most likely to be minimal if inflation is anticipated by the people. With anticipated inflation, people can build up their strategies to cope with inflation. If the annual rate of inflation in an economy is anticipated correctly, people will try to protect them against losses resulting from inflation. Workers will demand 10% wage increase if inflation is expected to rise by 10%. Similarly, a percentage of inflation premium will be demanded by creditors from debtors. Business firms will also fix prices of their products in accordance with the anticipated price rise. Now, if the entire society learns to live with inflation, the redistributive effect of inflation will be minimal. However, it is difficult to anticipate properly every episode of inflation. Further, even if it is anticipated, it cannot be perfect. In addition, adjustment with the new expected inflationary conditions may not be possible for all categories of people. Thus, adverse redistributive effects are likely to occur. Finally, anticipated inflation may also be costly to the society. If people's expectation regarding future price rise becomes stronger, they will hold less liquid money. Mere holding of cash balances during inflation is unwise since its real value declines. That is why people use their money balances in buying real estate, gold, jewelry, etc. Such investment is referred to as unproductive investment. Thus, during inflation of anticipated variety, there occurs a diversion of resources from priority to non-priority or unproductive sectors. B. Effect on production and economic growth. Inflation may or may not result in higher output. Below the full